A few years ago, I had an experience that I still think about to this day. It all started when my partner and I decided to take a much-needed vacation. Life had been stressful, and we were eager to get away from everything for a while. We found a charming cottage in Missouri that seemed perfect. The property was enormous, with acres of rolling hills, dense forests, and a river that cut right through the landscape. It felt like a hidden paradise, far away from the noise and bustle of the world. The cottage itself was beautiful, but my favorite part was the hot tub out on the covered porch. From there, I could sit and watch the scenery, soaking in the sights and sounds of nature. It felt like the perfect escape. We spent the first few days relaxing, enjoying the peace and quiet, and exploring the land around the cottage. Each day felt like a new adventure, and it was a relief to be so far removed from everyday life. One day I decided to take a longer walk through the woods. I wanted to explore the land more thoroughly and see everything the property had to offer. The wildlife was stunning. Deer, birds, and even wild boars roamed freely in the forest. At one point, I thought I saw a black bear off in the distance, though it disappeared into the trees before I could get a better look. After a while, I found a particularly beautiful spot along the river. The water was clear and sparkling, and it felt like a perfect moment of peace. I continued following the river, enjoying the scenery and feeling completely at ease. Then, I noticed something unusual. Up ahead, near the riverbank, was a large animal drinking from the water. At first, I thought it was a bison. It was big and covered in thick, dark fur. I regretted not having my phone with me to take a picture of such a majestic creature. But as I moved closer, I realized that something was off. The animal was not quite what I had thought it was. Its fur was shaggy like a bison's, but it had strange, jagged spikes running down its back. That alone was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I had never seen anything like it before. As I stared at the creature, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I noticed something even stranger. The animal had a single large horn on its head, more like a rhinoceros than a bison. I felt a wave of unease as I continued to watch the creature. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I decided to keep my distance. As curious as I was, I didn't want to get too close to something so unfamiliar. The creature kept drinking from the river, oblivious to my presence, but then, without warning, it turned and looked directly at me. That's when I saw its face. It had one enormous eye in the middle of its forehead, and the moment it locked onto me, I felt a jolt of fear run through me. The creature let out a loud, terrifying scream, a sound so powerful that it seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I turned to run, sprinting back into the woods as fast as I could. I don't remember how long I ran. I was panicked, lost, and unsure of where I was. I must have run for miles before I finally collapsed from exhaustion. The next thing I knew, it was dark, and I was lying on the forest floor with no idea how much time had passed. I had no phone, no flashlight, and no sense of direction. I called out for my partner, but the forest was silent except for the distant sound of the river. For a moment, I thought I might never find my way back to the cottage. The woods felt endless, and the memory of that strange creature was still fresh in my mind. I got to my feet, determined to follow the river back to the cottage. I figured that if I stayed close to the water, I would eventually find something familiar. I walked for hours, the darkness making everything look strange and unfamiliar. Every rustle in the trees made me jump, but I kept moving, hoping that I would eventually see a sign of the cottage. Then I smelled something, a faint, smoky scent that reminded me of a campfire. Relief flooded over me as I realized it must be my partner lighting a fire back at the cottage. I followed the smell, and soon enough, I saw the warm glow of the fire through the trees. When I finally reached the cottage, I was exhausted, thirsty, and completely drained. I barely made it to the campfire before collapsing again. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in a hospital bed with my partner sitting next to me. They told me I had been found passed out near the fire and rushed to the hospital for dehydration and exhaustion. I told my partner about the strange creature I had seen in the woods, describing its massive body, the spikes along its back, and its single giant eye. They listened, but they were convinced that I had just been hallucinating from the dehydration and stress. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if they were right. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I had always felt like there was a piece of me missing. Growing up in the United States as the son of Korean immigrants, I was surrounded by two cultures. At school and with my friends, I was just another American kid. But at home, things were different. My parents spoke Korean, cooked Korean food, and celebrated Korean holidays. They always encouraged me to embrace both worlds, but I often felt disconnected from my Korean roots. I knew very little about my relatives in Korea, having never met them. That changed when I finally decided to take a trip to South Korea, a journey I hoped would bring me closer to my heritage. When I arrived, my relatives were warm and welcoming, treating me like I was part of the family despite the distance between us. It felt surreal. They showed me around their city, introducing me to the rich traditions of Korean culture that I had only heard about in passing. I learned about the food, the temples, and the folk tales that had been passed down for generations. One of the stories that caught my attention was that of the Jangsan-beom. The Jangsan-beom, my cousins explained, was a creature that lurked in the dense mountains of Korea. It was said to resemble a tiger, with pale white fur and a long, slender body. But what made it truly terrifying was its ability to mimic human voices. The legend said that it would call out to travelers, imitating the cries of a loved one or a helpless child. If you followed the sound, it would lead you deeper into the woods, where it would strike. The story fascinated me. In all my years of living in the United States, I had never heard of anything like the Jangsan-beom. I knew about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't just a wild beast. It was something far more sinister, something that played on your emotions and fears. As I listened to my cousins, I couldn't shake the feeling of curiosity building inside me. They told me that sightings of the Jangsan-beom were rare, but some people believed it still roamed the mountains near Busan. My relatives laughed it off as just another ghost story, but I found myself intrigued. I wanted to see the mountains for myself, to experience the mystery firsthand. A few days later, I set out on my own to explore the mountains. It was a decision made partly out of a desire for adventure and partly out of a need to connect with something deeper. I wanted to see the Korea that wasn't just temples and bustling streets. I wanted to feel the untamed wildness of the land. The hike was beautiful. The air was cool, the path winding through thick forests of pine and bamboo. As I climbed higher, the sounds of the city below faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I found myself thinking about the Jangsan-beom and wondering if the legends had any truth to them. Was it just a myth to scare people away from the mountains? Or was there something lurking in the shadows, watching me as I walked? The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then I'd hear a sound, a twig snapping, a rustle in the bushes. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It could have been the wind or a small animal, but my mind kept returning to the stories I had heard. The view was stunning, with the rolling hills and valleys stretching out below me. For a moment, I forgot all about the Jangsan-beom and just stood there, taking in the beauty of the landscape. But then I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable above the sound of the wind. It was a voice, soft and distant, calling out from somewhere in the trees. I froze, straining to hear more clearly. The voice grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was speaking in Korean, a language I understood but wasn't completely fluent in. The words were hard to make out, but it sounded like someone calling for help. I remembered what my cousins had said about the Jangsan-beom's ability to mimic human voices. Could it be real? Was this the creature calling out to me, trying to lure me into the woods? I stood there, unsure of what to do. A part of me wanted to follow the voice, to see if someone really was in trouble. But another part of me, the part that remembered the old stories, told me to stay put. I glanced around, searching the trees for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the thick forest and the growing darkness. The voice called out again, this time closer. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were rooted to the spot, held in place by some invisible force. And then, the voice stopped. The forest fell silent. Not even the wind stirred, but nothing happened. There was no movement, no sound, just the eerie stillness of the woods. Eventually, I forced myself to turn away and head back down the mountain. The hike back felt longer than before, each step heavy with the weight of what I had experienced. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. When I finally reached the base of the mountain, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. I hadn't seen the Jangsan-beom, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had been walking for hours. My bag was heavy on my back, and the straps dug into my shoulders. Inside was all I owned, a few pieces of clothing, some canned food, and my beat-up old tent. I had no idea where I was going to sleep that night. I was far from the city, in the middle of nowhere, just looking for a place to rest my head. The trees around me were thick and dark. Every now and then, I'd hear the snap of a twig, but I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I'd been out here before. I knew the sounds of the forest. The night wasn't something to fear, not when you had been living like this for as long as I had. You learn to get used to it. But that night, something felt different. As I trudged along, looking for a good spot to set up my tent, I saw something in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape moving between the trees. I thought it was maybe a big dog. I squinted, trying to make it out, but it was hard to see. The moon was only half full, casting a dim light through the branches. Then it moved closer, and I realized it wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I had ever seen. I froze in place, too scared to move. The figure was tall, standing on two legs like a person, but its body was all wrong. Its skin looked rough and scaly, like the hide of a gator. Its arms were long, its fingers clawed. It had a head that looked like a cross between a man and a reptile, with sharp teeth jutting out from its mouth. I blinked, telling myself I was just seeing things. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was hunger messing with my mind. I hadn't eaten much in days, just some crackers and an old can of beans. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the creature was still there, moving closer. My whole body felt like it had turned to stone. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. All I could do was stand there and stare as the thing moved through the trees, its yellow eyes glowing in the dark. It didn't seem to notice me. It just walked slowly, weaving between the trees, its heavy tail dragging behind it, leaving a trail in the dirt. For a moment, I thought I was about to lose my mind. There was no way this was real. I had to be hallucinating. My stomach growled, reminding me of how long it had been since I had eaten a proper meal. I was just seeing things, I told myself. There was no such thing as a gator man. I was just tired, hungry, and out of my head. But it didn't disappear. The creature kept moving, disappearing into the shadows. Eventually, it vanished from sight, leaving nothing but the rustle of leaves behind. I stood there waiting to see if it would come back. It never did. When I finally got control of my body again, I forced myself to move. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my tent and set it up in a small clearing. My eyes darted around, watching the trees, half expecting the creature to come back. But the night was quiet, and nothing stirred. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the dark made me jump. I kept thinking about what I had seen. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but the image of those glowing yellow eyes and that scaly skin wouldn't leave my head. The next morning, I packed up and started heading back to the city. I needed to get away from those woods, away from whatever I had seen. My stomach ached with hunger, but I pushed through, walking until the city skyline finally came into view. When I got back, I tried to tell some of the guys I knew on the street about what I had seen. They were sitting around, sharing a bottle, and I figured they might believe me, might listen. But as soon as I started talking, I could see the looks they were giving me. They thought I was crazy. They told me I was probably seeing things because I was hungry, or worse, that I'd taken something to mess with my head. No one believed me. They laughed it off, saying I was just telling stories. Some of them even said I should stop making stuff up to get attention, but I wasn't making it up. I didn't talk about it after that. What was the point? I knew the truth, even if no one else did. I don't remember everything perfectly, but I'll try my best to share what happened. It was such a strange and unsettling experience that I've second-guessed myself countless times. I've gone over the details in my mind so many times that I've started to question whether it was even real. But after all that thinking, I've decided that yes, I do believe it happened. That's why I'm writing this down for you now. You see, I'm not the type of person who imagines things or gets carried away by wild stories. I don't drink alcohol, I don't do drugs, and I avoid scary movies. I've always trusted my senses, and I have a pretty strong mind. So, when I tell you what I saw, I believe it was real, no matter how unbelievable it might sound. It all started late one night when my partner and I were driving home from the movies. We'd gone to a drive-in theater. If you've never been to one, it's an outdoor movie theater where you sit in your car and watch the screen from there. It's a fun experience, but the movies start late since they need it to be dark enough. We stayed for the double feature, meaning we watched 2 movies back to back, which meant we didn't leave until after midnight. The drive home was going to take about an hour. Most of it was on the highway, but part of it was through some back roads. These roads weren't like the ones you might be used to driving on in the city or the suburbs. They were narrow, winding roads through dense, dark woods. There weren't any streetlights, no houses nearby, and that night, not even any moonlight. It was completely overcast, so the only light we had came from our car's headlights cutting through the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal, just a quiet drive through the woods. But then something strange happened. It's one of the clearest details I remember from that night. I saw a light, this red light, appear in my rearview mirror. It was odd because it wasn't a normal car's headlights. It was small and red, and it didn't move like a car would. It stayed still in the lower right corner of my rearview mirror, just sitting there. We drove for a couple of minutes, and the red light stayed in the same spot, not getting closer or farther away. It didn't blink or flicker either. It was just there. I thought maybe it was some kind of reflection, but that didn't make sense either because we were out in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing else around that could have reflected light. After a minute or two, we went around a bend in the road, and the light disappeared. At that point, I started thinking it could be something like an emergency vehicle, or maybe even a strange light on a faraway radio tower. But just as quickly as the light disappeared, it reappeared once we were back on a straight stretch of road. And this time, it was closer. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I noticed that the light wasn't just a distant object anymore. It was growing larger. I realized that whatever it was moving toward us. I don't know why, but I didn't feel scared right away. I was just confused. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of vehicle we didn't recognize, or maybe something harmless that just looked strange because of the dark. But things quickly got scarier. The red light was now growing larger and moving toward us much faster than I had expected. I watched it in the rearview mirror, and soon it was so big that it filled the mirror. It was no longer just a dot. I could feel its red glow casting shadows inside the car. It was illuminating the dashboard and even reflecting off the rearview mirror's warning message, the one that says, "Objects in mirror are closer than they appear." That message had never felt more real. My partner noticed the light too and was getting scared. She grabbed my arm, her grip tight, and begged me to drive faster. I wanted to speed up, but the road was too dangerous, narrow, winding, and full of bends. I was afraid that if I went any faster, I'd lose control of the car and drive off the road into a ditch or worse. The red light was right behind us now. I could feel its presence. It felt like it was pressing in on us, like it was trying to catch us. I dared to take a quick glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it, fully. The red orb, glowing brightly, was only a few feet from our bumper. It wasn't a car. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. It was just this round, pulsating light that filled me with a sense of dread. And then, nothing. The next thing I remember, we were pulled over on the side of the road. The sun was rising, and the sky was starting to brighten. I looked around, confused. We were still sitting in the car, our seatbelts on, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if I'd been frozen in that moment of panic. But the strange thing was, I didn't remember stopping the car. I didn't remember pulling over. My partner was just as confused. We both looked at each other, and we both remembered the red light, how it was chasing us, how scared we were, and then, nothing. Just the sudden, strange realization that we were now parked on the side of the road, as if no time had passed at all. We tried to make sense of what had happened. My partner thought maybe we had driven through some kind of chemical fog, something released by a local farm that made us pass out. But that explanation didn't really hold up. We hadn't smelled anything strange, and we both remembered the same thing: the red light, the fear, and then nothing. One cold, rainy evening, I was walking home from school. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep warm, but I could still feel the chill in my bones. As I turned onto my street, I noticed something strange. There was a house at the end that I'd never seen before. It was old and worn, with dark, broken windows and a roof that looked like it was about to collapse. I had walked this way many times, but the house had never been there before. I wondered how I could have missed it. The closer I got, the more I felt something wasn't right. The house seemed out of place, almost as if it didn't belong there. My heart started to race, but I couldn't stop myself from walking towards it. I felt drawn to it, like something inside was calling me. When I reached the front of the house, I stopped. The door was wide open, creaking in the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring at the dark hallway inside. It looked like no one had lived there for years. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but my feet kept moving. Before I knew it, I was stepping inside. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the house. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in dust. Old furniture sat in the corners, forgotten and decayed. Everything was silent except for the sound of my breathing and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. As I walked deeper into the house, I saw a staircase leading up to the second floor. Something inside me told me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was upstairs. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, I found a small room. The door was slightly ajar, and inside there was a single window that let in just enough light to see. In the middle of the room stood a large, old mirror. It was covered in dust, but I could see my reflection faintly. I stared at the mirror for a moment, and that's when I noticed something. Behind me, in the reflection, was a shadow. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. My heart pounded as I looked back at the mirror. The shadow was still there, standing right behind me. It wasn't a person, but a dark figure, tall and thin with no face. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor, and I couldn't move. The shadow in the mirror slowly raised its hand, reaching towards me. I shut my eyes tight, hoping it was just a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, the shadow was gone. The mirror was cracked, and the room was colder than ever. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran out of the house as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safely outside.